Think of our winter programs that get started back next week, and thank you for it. Thank you for that ministry that we have here and the influence it's had on kids and adults for so many years now. So we pray, Lord, you just continue to allow that ministry, Lord, to be an effective one. Thank you for the people who are involved with it, who come and spend the extra time on Wednesday night with the kids. Pray, Lord, you continue to give them the strength and patience that they need. As the kids are coming in, Lord, they're listening and learning about you. They're seeing the importance of having a relationship with you in their lives as well. And that they are then going back to their situations, Lord, sometimes maybe probably pretty difficult places that they're at, but they're able to shed God's love, shed your love, Lord, shed the gospel of people who are around them. Thank you for our honor program again and for the ones in classes. We'll be starting our 7th lesson in our study here of the divided kingdom. And today we're going to be looking at the careless king here meeting his end. We're looking at Elijah and Elisha as well, and kind of the changing of the guard from Elijah going over into Elisha, which we kind of mentioned a couple of weeks ago. But we're going to see a little more of that today. And so we'll be back. We've gone now from 1 Kings over to Chronicles, and we spent a couple of weeks in Chronicles. Now we're back into 2 Kings, as those books kind of go hand in hand with each other. And we're going to start off by looking at Ahaziah, the king who was selfish, the king who did not do what he was supposed to do, and some of the problems that happened because of it. All right, so in chapter 1 of 2 Kings, we again see Ahaziah, who was the selfish king. He followed after Baal, and the problems that came because of that, and some of the stuff that happened in his life. All right, so the first thing I want to show you, though, is this dynasties in the divided kingdom that we've been kind of going over for quite some time now. And as you can see, of all the different dynasties in both Israel and in Judah as well, we are in 885 in the 4th dynasty over here. Omri, Ahab, and Ahaziah, who we're looking at today, kind of gives you the correlation to what kings were in Israel and what kings were in Judah during this time. Okay, 772 BC is kind of where we're trying to get to, because that's the place in which the kingdoms end, especially for the ones in Israel. And then 586 BC is when the Judaic kingdom ends, but the line continues through David's dynasty, just as it was promised that it would be. And eventually Christ comes from that as well. So this is, again, we've been through these kings. This is kind of the laundry list, the timeline we've been going through. So we're now there. We just finished up Ahab. We saw him getting killed last week with a stray arrow that was just loosed and for really no apparent reason. It was divinely appointed, and he hit Ahab right where it needed to hit him, so he eventually bled out and died in his chariot. So now we're on to Ahaziah, and as we continue to kind of go through these kings. So that's who we're going to look at. First 8 of chapter 1 of the book of 2 Kings, we're going to see the continued history of these two kingdoms, of course, in Israel and in Judah. Now, the first of this book opens up with just a brief report on what has happened and the fact that this nation of Moab has rebelled against the king. So let's look at verse 1 here of 2 Kings chapter 1, and we see that it says, "Then Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab." So Ahab has just died, and then we see that the Moabites are rebelling against the Israelites. Now, King David, when he was in charge, subdued the Moabite country. Okay, and this country is just east of the Dead Sea. And when Israel divided in the days of Jeroboam, Moab then fell under the control of the northern kingdom. Okay, so when the nations divided, Moab, who had been conquered by David, fell under the control of the northern kingdom. That suppression continues up until just recently now that Ahab has died, all right, in the timeline that we're looking at. So during this brief reign of Ahaziah, the king of Israel, the Moabites are going to rebel out from underneath the control. And then some more things kind of happen with this rebellion, as we're going to see here in just a second. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at as far as the history goes. The Moabites are rebelling against King Ahaziah, and Ahaziah, who is Ahab's second son. And his reign over the kingdom only lasted just a few months or just a few weeks more than a year. Okay, provoked the Lord to anger eventually, as we're going to see, just like his father had done. And the judgment on him that he gets shows just how selfish and how inwardly focused that he had become kind of on himself. God, what we see here, creates this health crisis. His attention, and this is over. The king fell through. Essentially, what happens to him is the king falls through the lattice work that is in his room, and he falls down through the lattice, and as he's falling down, he hits the lattice, hits the ground, and it causes some life-threatening injuries to kind of come to him. And then faced with the fact that he's going to die very soon, the king sends messengers to Ekron in the land of the Philistines to ask the god Baal to help him survive his injuries. Okay? And Ahaziah here, the king, is planning to persuade Baal to spare his life by appeasing him. So this is kind of where we're at here with this king. All right, so he's life-threatening injuries that have happened. He's requesting the help of the false god Baal. And this is, let's see, I'm going to go back one. This right here. This is kind of what we're going to be looking at. All right, so we get to verse 2 here of chapter 1, and we see this health crisis that kind of happens to the king during this time. So Ahaziah, fell down through the lattice, verse 2, in his upper chamber that was in Samaria. And because of that, he was sick. And he sent messengers and said unto them, Go inquire of Baal Zebub, of the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease. But the angel of the Lord said unto Elijah the Tishbite, Arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say unto them, It is not because there is not a God in Israel that ye go to inquire of Baal Zebub, the god of Ekron. Now therefore thus saith the Lord, Thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art up, but shalt surely die. And Elijah departed. So we see now the king sending help from the false god Baal. God tells Elijah to go up and intercept these guys who are going to petition the god of Baal, the false god, to help him from his disease and help him from the problems that he had because he fell down through the lattice work in his room. Elijah does just that. He goes, intercepts these guys on their way, and he asks them, or points them towards this rhetorical question here that kind of God wants him to ask. So back to verse 3, right? So he meets them, and he is going to ask them, at the bottom part of verse 3, Is it not because there is not a God in Israel that ye go to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron. All right. So Elijah does exactly as God asked him to do. Goes, intercepts, and meets these guys, and telling them that he eventually gets to verse 4. And because as Ahaziah is seeking out the false god here instead of God, that was going to be the reason for his death sentence, that he was going to die. Verse 4. Now therefore thus saith the Lord, Thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone away, but surely die. And Elijah departed. So Elijah tells Ahaziah, answers the question here, telling him essentially that he is going to die from his injuries. Okay, and the fact that he sought out this false god instead of seeking out God is the underlying or the understood reason here that Ahaziah was going to die from the predicament that he was in. The messengers brings Elijah's message. Of course, Elijah intercepts and talks to these guys. They bring this message back to the king, starting in verse 5. All right. So when the messengers came back, it says, turned back unto him, and he said unto them, why are ye now turned back? And they said unto him, there came a man up to meet us, and he said unto us, go, turn again unto the king that sent you, and say unto him, thus saith the Lord, is it not because there is not a God in Israel, that thou sendest to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone, but shalt surely die. And he, the king, said unto them, what manner of man which was he which came up to meet you, and told you these words? And they said unto him, and they answered him, he was a hairy man, and girt with a girdle of leather about his loins. And he said, it is Elijah the Tishbite. Okay, so he asks, they go back, talk to the king. King says, well, who in the world is this? Who told you this? They give the description of him, the hairy man that the loins girt about with the belt, and he knew then that it was the prophet Elijah the Tishbite that had given them this message, this report of doom back to the king, again, because of his lack of seeking out God during this difficult time that he had in his health. All right, so it brings us to verse 9. Okay, so we see Elijah here intercepting the king's meeting, sends them back, tells them the message, and then we see the king now focusing on himself. So he's seeking out Baal's will instead of God's. And yet, even now, in the midst of knowing this is probably going to happen to him, in response, he has more thinking about himself. Right? Verse 9. And then the king sent unto him a captain of 50 with his 50. And he went up to him, and behold, sat on top of a hill, and spake unto him, thou man of God, the king hath said, come down. And Elijah answered and said to the captain of the 50, if I be a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven and consume thee and thy 50. And there came down fire from heaven and consumed him and his 50. So in response to this, the king dispatches a captain and 50 of probably the best soldiers that he has to go to find Elijah and to arrest him. Okay, and so they're out. They come up on Elijah. Elijah's up on a hill. They see him. They're probably making aware to him that the king didn't like what you had to say. The king sent us here to take you into custody, take you back to him, put you into jail. And Elijah, as he's sitting up there, says, if I'm a man of God, as I said that I am, let fire essentially just kind of rain down from heaven and consume all 50 of you. And then in the midst of him saying that, we see that instantly right after that, the Lord allows Elijah to call down fire in his name and consume all 50 of those soldiers. All right? Let me get to verse 11. The king hears of this, realizes that these 50 men have been consumed by fire that Elijah had called down from heaven. And we get to verse 11. It says this, again also he sent unto him another captain of 50 with his 50, and he answered and said unto him, O man of God, thus hath the king said, come down quickly. So after the first 50 didn't work, the king sends back 50 more. And they meet Elijah sitting on the same hill, probably sitting in the exact same spot, probably hasn't moved a muscle. And these 50 guys roll up on him, and they tell him as well. King said, didn't like what you had to say, going to bring you back, going to take you into arrest, got a problem with you.
And Elijah answers back to him in verse 12. And Elijah answered and said this, and said unto them, If I be a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume thee and thy 50. And the fire of God came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. So the exact same fate, the first 50 happened to them, the exact same thing happened to the second 50 that came to Elijah as well. We'll get to verse 13. So the king hears this again. This is twice this has happened. He's lost 50 men to fire from heaven, just like Elijah said it was going to happen. Verse 13. The king again. He sent again a captain of the third 50 with his 50. And they came and the third captain of 50 and came and fell on his knees before Elijah and besought him and said unto him, O man of God, I pray thee, let my life and the life of these 50 thy servants be precious in thy sight. So the king sends a third contingent of men out there to capture Elijah. Now these old boys knew exactly what had happened to the first two sets. So they come upon Elijah, and instead of offering up the sentence of taking him into custody, they go up to him, drop straight on their knees, and say, listen, we've seen what has happened with these other two groups. We don't want the same thing happening to us. We know you're a man of God. We know the power that you wield because of in the name of God. We don't want the same thing to happen to us that's happened to them. So the third company wisely secured Elijah's mercy for himself and for all of the men as well. And he specifically requests in verse 14 as we... Verse 14 specifically requests that Elijah considers the soldiers' lives as being precious. All right, verse 14, Behold, there came fire from heaven and burned up the two captains of the former 50s with their 50s. Therefore let my life now be precious in thy sight. Okay, so based on this few verses now that we've kind of looked at, what do you think... as the king, as Ahaziah, what do you think he thought about the lives of his men? Didn't care, right? He's going to send the third group out there. I would think you, as a king, probably intelligent, probably understands war and battle and all those things. I would imagine that after, if you know, and maybe not, but if we're one of us is sitting in that same throne and we send somebody out there and this old boy calls down fire from heaven and destroys 50 of my men, or the captain 50 of the men, I'm probably not going to send any more out there. Right? It's probably dealing with something that I can't control. But he doesn't see that. He has no remorse. He considers his men's lives to be actually no value at all. He's only concerned for himself. The only life that he thought was precious was his own life. Then we get to verse 15. So we see the focusing on himself. We then see him being condemned to death because of it. Verse 15. And the angel of the Lord said unto Elijah, Go down with him, be not afraid of him. And he arose and went down with him unto the king. And he said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Forasmuch as thou hast sent messengers to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, it is not because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word. Therefore thou shalt not come down off that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. So we see now the angel of the Lord coming to Elijah, saying, All right, Elijah, now you go and deliver the message to the king. That his life is going to be taken because of him not having any faith in me. And him seeking after false gods. So Elijah does, again, exactly as he is told to. He goes, condemns the life of the kings to death because of his not following after God. We get to verse 17. So he died according to the word of the Lord, which Elijah had spoken. And Jehoram reigned in his stead in the second year of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. Jehoram, the son of Ahab, then reigns in his place. Okay, so Ahaziah here is a king that is an example of showing true futility in trying to live for yourself rather than living for God. Another example of these kings now, time and time again, we've seen these guys not do what God wants them to do. And as a result of that, they premature deaths, they die at early age, they have these problems that happen to them because they just simply will not listen to the will of God. They're disobedient, they're self-satisfying, and they have no desire to allow God to control in their lives. And this is not the first time we've seen this, right? These kings now, there's been a bunch of these kings that have done that. And you would think they would learn from the previous one's mistakes, but they don't. They continue to do the same thing over and over and over. Okay, so that's the first chapter of 2 Kings. Now we get to the second part. The second chapter is we get a look at a little closer at the life of Elijah. Okay, so these 18 verses here of chapter 2, the first 18 verses here of chapter 2, we see a little bit more of Elijah's ministry and kind of what he was doing. This is more closer now to the end of Elijah's ministry. It's as we're going to begin to see the transition from Elijah being the prophet of God to Elisha being the prophet of God. But we're going to see, first of all, this sharp difference, this huge contrast here in Elijah's life and the way in which Ahaziah was living. Because Ahaziah, again, living for himself, Elijah, on the other hand, completely selfless. Right, only concerned about what God wanted him for his life. He was very humble and did whatever God wanted him to do. Okay, so first 4 verses here of chapter 2, and we're going to look at this little section here. A couple points I'll show you, and then we'll be done. Get to verse 18, we'll finish up. But we see that first 4 verses here that Elijah, following, regardless of what God told him to do, what he told him to do, where he told him to go, we see Elijah following God's lead here. Okay, verse 1 of chapter 2, and it came to pass when the Lord would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. Now, 6 years, okay? 6 years have passed since Elisha learned that, since being anointed, Elisha learned that Elijah's ministry was getting close to coming to an end. So Elisha here determines not to let this great prophet Elijah out of his sight, out of his presence. He wanted to be with him the whole time because he realized that Elijah's ministry was getting close to coming close to an end. And so we see, though, Elijah now giving Elisha some tests and doing some stuff to try to, test the faith, test the spiritual strength of Elisha. Verse 2, and Elijah said unto Elisha, tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord hath sent me to Bethel. And Elisha said unto him, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. So they went down to Bethel. So Elijah is telling Elisha, stay here. Times this happens. Okay, this is the first. There are 3 separate instances in which he tries to get Elisha to stay or to leave or get away from him, and Elisha insists over and over and over again on following Elijah until the very end of his ministry. Okay, Elijah followed God's leading out of the promised land. Their very first stop they were going to go together was Gilgal. Okay, so get to verse 2. And Elijah again said unto Elisha, tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord hath sent me to Bethel. And Elisha said unto him, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. So they went to Bethel. So, if you will with me, please, turn over to Joshua chapter 4. So in verse 1, we see the first stop they go to, which is Gilgal. And we're going to see the importance of why they were stopping at Gilgal. So Joshua chapter 4, and let's start by looking at verse 19. All right, and the people came up of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and encamped in Gilgal, the east border of Jericho. In those 12 stones, which they took out of the Jordan, did Joshua pitch in Gilgal. And he spake unto the children of Israel, saying, when your children shall ask their fathers in time of come, saying, what mean these stones? Then ye shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan from before you until you were passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up from before us until we were gone over, that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord that is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. First place they go is to Gilgal. Now, as we've read here, what is important? What's a big deal? What happened here in Gilgal? This is the first stop for who? The children of Israel when Joshua led them to the promised land, right? This is the first stop for them. So why do you think that Elijah and Elisha, why do you think God led them to Gilgal? What's the reason you think he took them there first? There's a purpose here, right? There's definitely a purpose God sends them there. What do you think the purpose is? The beginning of the faithfulness. And it was served as a reminder to Elijah and Elisha of God's might and his grace, okay, in giving the land to the people of Israel. So God sends them there first. They see the stones. They see the memorial is there as a reminder of God's might and God's grace. Let's go back over to 2 Kings now, and let's look at verse 3 of chapter 2. First place they went was Gilgal. Elijah tells Elisha, I want you to stay here. He said, no, I'm going with you. Wherever you're going, I'm going. Second place, verse 2 and 3. Verse 3, I'm sorry. And the sons of the prophets that were at Bethel came forth to Elisha and said unto him, Knowest thou that the Lord will take away thy master from thy head today? And he said, Yea, I know it. Hold your peace. So the next stop here was the city of Bethel. Now, when they were in Bethel, where they're visiting, we see in verse 3, they visit a school for prophets. That's where the sons of the prophets that were at Bethel, there was a school there for them. They come out, they meet with Elisha, tell him essentially that Elijah's days are numbered. He's going to be gone very soon. And Elisha understands that, knows that the time is nearing for the end of Elijah's ministry, but tells the prophets there just to kind of hold their peace, not to say anything about it. He wants to see this thing done. So they go to Bethel. Now, if you will, let's go over to Genesis chapter 28. And let's look at verse number 10. Genesis 28, verse number 10, and we're going to read down through the rest of the chapter, okay? And Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows and laid down in that place for sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set upon the earth, and top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land. For I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. And Jacob awakened out of his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid and said, How dreadful is this place! This is none other but the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he put for his pillow and set it for a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. But the name of the city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in the ways that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I may come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone, which I have set for a pillar, shall be God's house, and all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee. Next stop here was Bethel. What is important about Bethel? Why would God take them here next? What is he showing them? We've seen God's grace and his might in Gilgal. What are we seeing in Bethel? promise, and showing God's promise shows God, and God promising something to Jacob, then keeping that promise shows God's what? Provisions, faithfulness, and trustworthiness. So we see them teaching in Gilgal about His grace and His might. We see Him teaching them in Bethel about His provision, His trustworthiness, His faithfulness, and the fact that God is always near. Let's go back to 2 Kings. Let's go to verse 4. And Elijah said unto him, Elisha, the third time, Now tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho. And he said, As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. So they came to Jericho. Next stop we see is Jericho. And the two men visited the sons of the prophets there as well. Now let's go back to Joshua chapter 6 and look at verse 12. Joshua 6 verse 12 says this, And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. And the 7 priests, bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord, went on continually, and blew with the trumpets, and with the armed men, and went before them. That the reward came after the ark of the Lord, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets, And the second day compassed the city once, returned to the camp, and so they did 6 days. And it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day, and compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priests blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, In the city shall be accursed, and even it, and all that therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that were sent. And ye, in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed things, lest ye make yourselves accursed. But when ye take the accursed things, make the camp of Israel accursed, and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord, that they shall come into the treasury of the Lord. And so, verse 20, the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets. And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, that the walls fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. So the third place they go is to Jericho, right? And as they're remembering about the time that the Lord told the people of Israel to march around the city of Jericho. They did exactly as was said for 6 days. On the 7th day, they did it 7 times. On the 7th time, when the priests blew with their trumpets, where there's not one stone standing on another stone, fell down flat. What about God do you think the prophets were considering while they were in Jericho? We've seen God's might, we've seen His will, we've seen His grace, we've seen His faithfulness. What do you think the lesson is here? God is able to do what? All right, let's consider a second the walls of Jericho. Right, just from history and knowing a little bit about Jericho, the walls were what? Incredibly thick, right? To the point they were able to run chariots and stuff on top of it. Right, one of the greatest fortified cities of the time was Jericho. The walls were so immaculate, right? They're so well fortified. God went in and completely eradicated those walls just when the people did what He told them to do. Why do you think God took them there? What's the lesson He's trying to teach them?
His mightiness.
His what?
Mightiness.
His mightiness, and the fact that what? He can provide. He provides, and what else? If anybody does what to the Lord? Nobody can. There is no enemy what? There is no enemy too great, right? There is no enemy too great for God. There is nothing, no enemy, no people that can come to the people of Israel, no army that can come before Elijah and Elisha. There is nothing that God is not able to defeat. God is mighty and able to defeat any enemy that He is confronted with. So there's 3 major lessons there that Elijah and Elisha have been kind of remembering, or God is teaching them or reminding them about as this is getting ready to kind of change over here. So this is kind of some of the stuff that Elijah is showing Elisha. We get now to verse 5, down through verse 10, and we'll finish up with this today. And we see Elijah in the midst of all this stuff, right? All the things he's been able to do. He's been able to call fire down on multiple occasions. Whenever he's needed, God has provided for him because of his faithfulness. And we still yet, though, see Elijah, even realizing the power that he has because of God, still doesn't get the big head, still stays very humble, doesn't become very proud of himself, and he stays continually focused on other people. Verse 5 of chapter 2 back in 2 Kings. And the sons of the prophets that were at Jericho came to Elisha and said unto him, Knowest that the Lord will take away thy master from thy head today? And he answered, Yea, I know, hold your peace. And Elijah said unto him, Tarry, I pray thee here, for the Lord hath sent me to Jordan. And he said, As the Lord liveth, as my soul liveth, I will not leave thee. And the two went down. And 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood to view afar off. And the two stood by, and they two stood by Jordan. And Elijah took his mantle and wrapped it together, and smote the waters, and that were divided hither and thither, so the two went over on dry ground. And it came to pass, when they were gone over, that Elijah said unto Elisha, Ask what I shall do for thee, before I be taken away from thee. And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And he said, Thou hast asked a hard thing, nevertheless, if thou see me when I am taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee, but if not, it shall not be so. So both now in Bethel and in Jericho, these sons of the prophets are with Elijah. They're pulling Elisha aside, telling him that it's not going to be long before the Lord takes Elijah away. And the final stop here on the prophet was the two walked to the Jordan River. Okay, 50 of these prophets followed these two guys and stood and watched them as the two men arrived at the river. Elijah takes off his coat, strikes the river, and we see the Lord opening up the waters, and they walk across on dry ground. Okay, these 50 men, Elisha had been so touched by Elijah's ministry, okay, and the fact that he was able to be so faithful to God, and in turn God faithful to him, they had a very, very high respect for them. And the respect was there because Elijah had invested himself into other people. Okay? He understood the importance of what God had called him to do, and he invested himself into other people, and we see the result of that here. 50 of these guys would probably followed him anywhere. Okay? Because of the respect that they had for him. You compare this 50 to the 50 that Ahaziah sent out. We see a huge difference here. But Elijah saw the importance of focusing on other people. And as the prophets watched, Elijah struck the Jordan, the river. God opened it up. And even after crossing the river, right, Elisha still here insists on being with Elijah and demands a double portion of his spirit. And Elijah promised to grant this request if Elisha witnessed the departure of Elijah. As the prophets watched these two men walk across in the same fashion of Israel leaving Egypt into the promised land, the two prophets probably even saw the 12 stones that were at the bottom of the Jordan River as they walked, that Joshua had set up. And it was a reminder of God's faithfulness and a testament to his promise to care for the people in his land. And Elisha still insists on being a double portion of Elijah. And Elijah even then focusing on Elisha. What can I do for you? How can I help you in whatever way that I can? We see Elijah, a man, did some amazing, amazing things happening before his eyes. Okay? If Elijah was here, he would tell us it was all because of the power of God. But that power of God happened because of Elijah's obedience to the will of God and his focus on making sure that other people understood the importance of what a relationship and God is like and what a faithfulness and obedience to God can provide in our lives as well. Okay? Now we'll finish this up next week. We're going to see Elijah being taken off. And then we'll see the mantle being passed over to Elisha. And we're starting to see a changing of the guard now between Elijah and Elisha. And we'll see some of the provisions that God gives Elisha as well as we continue to move through the book of 2 Kings. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson we have here. Thank you for the influence that Elijah had on the people that were around him. We don't see it in Scriptures. But those 50 prophets, the people that he was influenced by, probably had a major impact on the people that they influenced as well. And it was all because one man was dedicated to being faithful to your will, regardless of the cost. And then understanding the importance of investing himself into other people so that it could spread. Lord, I pray that is the same desire that we have an unfettered desire to be obedient to your will. And the second part is that as we take a conscious effort, Lord, to be investing ourselves into others so they see that importance as well. And Lord, I thank you for a pastor, Lord, that has that same heart and invests himself into us so that we can then as well be going and spreading to others as well. So I pray for him as he comes in the next hour, that you'll just use him in a mighty way, that you'll keep us attentive, Lord, to the words that he has, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. In your name I pray. Amen.